Sean, you want to ask the next question?
I do, but first I want to have a look at this comment. Someone said, sounds all very nice, but meaningless without addressing state power.
100%. Yeah.
So let's talk about state power. Let me get the question.
I
You,
completely.
Mhm. You argue for a federal agenda in Canada to support community wealth building.
Mhm.
How does this align with the Marxist understanding of the state's role?
Yeah.
Should we look to the state as an instrument of class rule that can also be reformed to redistribute wealth? Or is there an inherent tension in expecting the capitalist state to dismantle the systems that uphold it? Or would a little social democracy go a long way in trying to alleviate much of the inequality we're witnessing?
Hmm. Yeah. Can you reread those last 2 points? Because I think there's sort of two sections there. I want to make sure I address them both.
Sure. Should we look to the state as an instrument of class rule that can also be reformed to redistribute wealth?
Hmm.
Or is there an inherent tension in expecting the capitalist state to dismantle the systems that uphold it?
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Mhm.
So, and then you said about social democracy. Would a little social democracy go a long way?
Right, right.
Yeah. Okay. So, a couple of things about that. First off, when we talk about states today,
Mhm,
uh, they're in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom. We have a huge challenge. We have states today are much more varied in what that term means
mhm,
than it used to be. We have something like 200 nation states. Some of them have universal suffrage, proportional representation, 80+% voter turnout, and you can kind of demand a lot more in those circumstances than what we see in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom. We have first past the post electoral politics. We
mhm,
have uh, high levels of inequality. So that means you have concentrated electoral interests and
mhm,
concentrated economic interests. And in the mid 20th century, these institutions were more responsive to the working class. There was a little bit more working class voice in our democratic systems, and that has really declined. And I don't have all of the answers to that. I'm not going to pretend that I have all of the answers to that. What I can say is that powerful demonstrations at the local level do have ability to permeate higher levels of government sometimes. And there is, and so there is, it's not to say that it's a surefire recipe. I don't want to overstate this. There's a
mhm,
huge challenge here, no question. I can't solve it in 2 minutes. But one of the things that community wealth building does, two things that community wealth building does. The first is it reduces the perceived dependence upon big money. And one of the problems that we have right now is there is an institutionalized kind of consistency that we see from a lot of local levels of government, state or provincial levels of government, and national levels of government, where there is this perception that we need the big players and we need to suck up to them. That's still very prevalent. One
mhm,
of the things that community wealth building does is it creates an alternative locally, it creates a demonstration locally that shows that is not the case, that sometimes is able to ripple up. And so there is a way of chipping away here that could have larger impact. And we have seen some of that even in the United States. Now, the main champion for community wealth building in American politics was Jamal Bowman, who has recently been taken down, but he actually was
mhm,
able to get employee ownership as a procurement priority in the Chips and Science Act. And that was based on local demonstrations in places like Chicago, New York, developing the Worker Cooperative Business Development Initiative, and various others, Cleveland, various others across America, Rochester, another one. So there is the ability to undermine some of that relationship from local demonstrations. With that said, I again don't want to make it sound like this is easy. It absolutely is not. And in
mhm.
some places, it is certainly far more possible than others. And I have to say, in Canada, we're in a bit of a rush to see if we can get anything because we have a center rightish government. Really, Trudeau is, if you're on Twitter, he's a communist. But if you're in Canada, if you're in reality, he's a center right wing politician. And he's
Right.
probably about to get wiped out by a radical right wing politician, in which case I suspect all doors at larger levels of government will be shut. So I'm doing the best I can from in my political organizing capacity to see what I can do. But
Mhm.
uh, rest assured, I'm not naive about how challenging that is. So, uh, however, there was another question there, which was not just about how fucked up is Canada or the United States. It was about what should the appropriate role of the state be. And I think
Right.
that what we see here is, I hope I didn't take too long and
No, you're good.
this. Okay,
Mhm.
um, I think what we see here is an appropriate use of when we see community wealth building recognized by larger levels of government, we see a pretty appropriate use for government in the 21st century, which we have to, I think, rethink a little bit. Kind of major roles for government are typically allocation, regulation, and redistribution. We tend to focus redistribution of wealth after it's been produced, which was sort of alluded to in the um, introduction there, that
Mhm.
we have this idea that wealth building in a neoliberal way we can just have this huge amount of wealth that will solve all of our problems, and that has absolutely not happened. We can also talk about redistributing capital. We can talk about redistributing capital as cooperative capital, as community capital. A lot of the things that local democratic economics need to thrive are actually not rocket science. They are
Mhm.
things like publicity of the model, uh, educational and technical assistance resources, access to seed capital and loans. It isn't rocket science. And when you look at the places where this has absolutely taken off, it's basic stuff that makes this stuff happen. It is not rocket science. The enterprises work just fine. We are good at managing our own affairs.
Mhm.
We There is a buy-in for larger levels of government here because it isn't rocket science and because it actually makes their jobs easier. It makes their jobs easier to demonstrate results and to not have to do everything themselves. Not that they are doing everything themselves, but not to be constantly berated to do everything themselves, to actually hand power back to the people in very concrete ways. It isn't rocket science for them to do this. So there is potentially a buy in for larger levels of government to do this. In terms of social democracy, community wealth building is not dependent upon social democracy and absolutely can harness social democratic resources to use
Mhm.
those institutions, the procurement purchasing power of social democratic institutions to democratize the rest of the economy. And I think this is potentially, we might get to this a little later on, so maybe I should wrap up very quickly. But I think we need to look at where a bridge can be built between people who are on the democratic socialist end of the spectrum who want to change the fundamental layer of the economy, and the social democratic side that's more interested in compromise, inclusive growth, this kind of thing.
Mhm.
What Very few people who are on that inclusive growth side of the spectrum are actually opposed to things like worker-owned companies and cooperatives and community nonprofits. So there's a bridge here that can be built between those two camps, I think, that represent, depending on where you are, in a lot of major nations, somewhere between 40 and 70% of the electorate. So suddenly we've actually got potentially the ability to piece together something like a way out of corporate capitalism. Um, I can go further into that a little bit, but I'm taking up too much time. So I'll bring the questions.
No, not at all.